Very few people are as respected for their views of world order as is Professor Falk. He's focused on that issue intensely. He's been deeply concerned with the ethical implications of international law. He's looked at the questions of human rights and the environment, of course, with great care. So he not only is an acknowledged, serious student of American foreign policy, but has a particular skill and interest with respect to these great and important world order questions. I should make a parenthetical comment before I introduce our speaker and just remind you that we want to thank First National Bank this evening for the reception. And we will be joined in a couple of weeks by the president of the American-Russia Business Council. And then a couple of weeks after that by the chairman of the board of the Martin Marietta Corporation, Mr. Augustine, a well-known figure in the business community and one of the finalists, at least according to the papers, for the Secretary of State position. So we look forward to those programs. But I can't think of a topic which in general is any more interesting or encompassing than the one we have tonight. And I can't think of anyone I'd rather hear talk about it than Professor Falk. It's my great privilege and pleasure to introduce Professor Richard Falk.
Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here, although I must confess I've had some second thoughts about the title I chose for this talk. I was reminded of a review of a book entitled The Secret History of Japanese Sea Power, which ended by congratulating the author for keeping the secret so well. And possibly there is a certain tendency from the freedom of vantage point in a university to accentuate the critical side of our understanding of politics. Maybe it's bitterness because our phone hasn't been ringing enough. And I don't mean to make this a rhetorical question. I mean, it may be for some of you, does Clinton have a foreign policy? And in my meaner moments, I have thought of it as a rhetorical question. But I want to try to be uncharacteristically dispassionate and approach this in a more serious and balanced way if I'm able to. I will try to. There's a Beltway quip that perhaps is important to mention at the outset as a way of gaining a little perspective, which is, if you're not confused, you don't understand the world. Some have said this might be a very good defense for the foreign policy process that has emerged, but of course when confusion is embodied in policy, then it creates the impression of a mess and of a failure to have really understood what leadership entails for a country that has such a prominent role in the world as the United States has. I'm not often inspired by Nancy Reagan, but she said one thing that, again, provides a kind of introductory perspective for what I want to try to talk about. She was trying to explain why she felt that marijuana was so much worse than alcohol as a substance. And her explanation was that if you're on a plane and the pilot is high, you can't tell. But if he's drunk, you know. So the point of all this is that maybe Bill Clinton, when he was at Oxford, really didn't inhale. but instead grabbed another drink. And I think on the most superficial level, the arrogance of posing the question that I have arises from the feeling of a certain lack of coherence and professionalism, even in small matters, that has been characteristic of this presidency. For instance, when President Clinton agreed to meet the author Salman Rushdie, who is the author of the book Satanic Verses, as you know, and made a kind of point of expressing his commitment to free expression, that here was an author who had been condemned to death by Ayatollah Khomeini and had had to live underground, that it was important to give such a person a kind of dignity by meeting him, which he did. But then there was what one would have expected and was fully predictable, criticism from some of the Islamic governments. And then what the White House said was, well, it wasn't a real meeting. We just ran into each other in the corridor. And it was only for 3 minutes. You see, and the point of this is the seeming inability to stand firm in relation to positions even of a relatively simple and straightforward kind. The same thing happened in relation to the recognition of Macedonia. Again, not something on the mind of every American as he tries to fall asleep at night. But nevertheless, President Clinton, along with many other governments in the world, decided that if Bosnia and Croatia and Slovenia deserved to be recognized and have diplomatic relations, so did Macedonia. And he then announced that as a matter of commitment by his administration. But again, predictably, there was a furor provoked by the Greek lobby, and again, unfortunately, predictably, President Clinton decided that he had to think more about the relationship of the United States to Macedonia. And so, even though he acknowledged the existence of Macedonia, he now says that diplomatic relations with Macedonia will be deferred indefinitely. See, again, not the complexity of Bosnia or Haiti, where I think reasonable people can disagree, and no one can, I think, convincingly portray a clear, convincing line of policy. It's extremely difficult, I think. But on these smaller matters, in a way, the real weakness of the Clinton presidency in foreign policy, I feel, is revealed. And precisely because the world is so complicated and confusing at this post-Cold War stage, it's very crucial on small matters to establish some credibility that you are, as a leader of a country like the United States, taking positions that you understand and can reinforce and abide by, that you've thought through the problems before rather than encountered them the next morning. See, and that I think was the impression both with Rushdie and with this Macedonian issue, that they came almost as if they were surprises that there would be some friction generated by taking the positions that he had. Now, I think in the background of the whole reality of American foreign policy at this stage is the appreciation that no government of an important country at this stage seems to be led by a leader that is respected and admired by his citizenry. I can't remember a time in history where there's been such a global failure of leadership, and at a moment when one would have expected the opposite, when one would have expected with the end of the Cold War a real opportunity for new ideas, new approaches, and initiatives to have been forthcoming. But I won't go through the litany of examples to substantiate this point. We can maybe discuss it in afterwards. But it is a striking fact and suggests, it seems to me, that there must be some structural explanation for this simultaneous failure of leadership in so many parts of the world, in virtually every important country in the world. And that raises the question of what is it that may make it almost impossible to be successful as a leader. And one obvious explanation would be that the state, the territorial sovereign state, is confronted by not necessarily a crisis, but a set of tendencies that it hasn't yet learned to master. And these tendencies can be generally understood that on the one side, there's a very powerful momentum toward globalism, the integration of the world economy, and the globalization of communications and capital markets that bypass to a great extent the territorial state and make even the most powerful and rich states adapt to this set of circumstances. It, in other words, narrows the political space available to leaders to act on their own initiative. And this is in dynamic interaction with the emergence everywhere, virtually, of what I and others have called a politics of identity. That is, an assertion that the real basis of political community is not necessarily the nation state, but some kind of ethnic identification, religious identification, communal, some sort of communalism. We understand it in relation to the Islamic world in terms of fundamentalism. It has expressed itself in India in the form of Muslim Hindu riots of a very extreme sort and the rise of a very powerful Hindu nationalist, ultra-nationalist party. We see it tearing up countries, especially dissolving empires, the former Soviet Union and even more intensely the former Yugoslavia. All of these countries beset by these fragmentation of their former political reality and a sense of commitment, almost an unconditional commitment, to forming political communities that are based on these specific identities. So on the one side of the state, you have globalism and regionalism and on the other side you have fragmentation. And the United States is not as subject to either of these tendencies to the degree that smaller, more vulnerable countries are, but I think both sets of tendencies are manifest in our recent experience. And there is what is come now to be called multiculturalism in the United States that is, I think, rapidly displacing the whole political myth that was a defining myth for America of a melting pot. We have a new kind of domestic reality. So I think that one of the explanations of this failure of political imagination and leadership has to do with the inability to mediate between this globalizing set of tendencies and the fragmenting set of tendencies. Now, a second, I think, set of tensions and problems that were more specific to the United States and to Bill Clinton than to many other leaders was the degree to which he based his presidential bid upon the idea of focusing on the domestic policy agenda, that he criticized George Bush for trying to be, first of all, president of the world rather than president of the United States, and that he, Clinton, was going to reverse that. And that meant that on the one side, he was committed to a low visibility foreign policy. But on the other side, in order to make his moral criticism of the Bush presidency more effective, he promised to do more internationally. He promised to take a more compassionate policy toward the Haitian refugees and to restore Aristide to power. He promised a more assertive approach to Somalia and to Bosnia. So there was somehow lost in the feverish pressures of a campaign this sense that he might get elected, and then what? How could he be a low-profile? How could he have a low-profile foreign policy and yet do more? We can all dream, but that dream has high consequences because part of doing more risked the lives of Americans, as was evident in the first set of real policy failures, which was in Somalia. And you can't, in a democratic society, expect young people to risk their lives for something that you're trying to convey as being unimportant. See, and because he had conveyed this to be unimportant, and I'm not sure it was unimportant, but it was conveyed to be unimportant, there was no public foundation laid for accepting the losses, and there was a backlash in Congress, and there was a reversal of the policy. Now, there are two things in the course of that Somalia experience that I think are instructive. First of all, there was the failure by the Clinton administration to clearly grasp why I think George Bush had defined the mission in Somalia in very narrow terms. You remember it was just to get the food and medical supplies to the hungry people. It was not to enter the very dangerous and difficult domain of political restructuring. See, and what President Clinton did in conjunction with the Secretary General of the UN is to slide over from that narrow conception of the mission in Somalia to the wider one. And that became very wide indeed when the central purpose seemed to be to capture General Aidid, one of the, for better and worse, one of the political leaders in Somalia. And in order to capture him in a setting where you didn't want to risk American lives beyond the most minimum amount, the reliance was placed on very inappropriate weaponry. Helicopter gunships used against heavily civilian populated areas. And so it never was General Aidid caught, but clan leaders were killed by helicopter gunships, and you had a complete reversal of the sense of what the United States' relationship to Somalia was. We had been welcomed, you remember, those television, early television pictures of the American forces coming there, welcomed by the civilian crowds, and then in the end, that terrible image of the dead American being dragged through the streets of South Mogadishu. See, that's all part of this idea that you can have what one might call cheap interventions. Intervention is hard enough when you find a strategic justification and you somehow convey that to the public. Intervention failed for the United States in Vietnam when there was an enormous mobilization of strategic support for the intervention and overwhelming military superiority. What Lyndon Johnson once called a 10th-rate Asian power. So that part of the dynamic of discovery here is that whether an intervention is justified by humanitarian arguments or is under the UN auspices or has heavy military capabilities, it can be easily frustrated by resistance tactics and efforts. And this is an enormous change from the 19th century when gunboat diplomacy was such a cost-effective way of projecting power onto weaker countries, where just a small number of Marines landing in the capital city was enough to politically restructure the country. Something important has happened in the world, and that is the spread of nationalism as a mass mobilizing force and the discovery of tactics by the forces, low technology forces of resistance, of how to neutralize military superiority. An illustration of that during the Reagan administration was the one truck bomb in Beirut that killed 241 Marines and reversed U.S. policy. Terrorism effectively applied makes a country like the United States extremely vulnerable when it tries to enter a society where there is strong, deep resistance, whether that resistance is justifiable or not. That's not the point. Well, my big contention here is that in order for the United States to assert the kind of leadership that is necessary to respond to the challenges posed by Somalia and Bosnia in particular, and to some degree by Haiti, would require a high visibility foreign policy, and then it might fail. But all along, President Clinton has taken the view that the only way his presidency is going to succeed is to keep foreign policy on the back burner unless it's foreign economic policy. And there he has acknowledged the power of these globalizing economic forces, successfully pushing NAFTA through the political process against strong opposition, and successfully concluding the GATT negotiations. Interestingly, both essentially Republican issues, as George Bush has pointed out gently, and both requiring, especially NAFTA, the president to abandon traditional Democratic Party constituencies in order to succeed. In other words, he was quite unconditional in supporting NAFTA, despite the fact that organized labor, liberal church groups, many minority groups were opposed, traditional constituencies of the Democratic Party. And he even went so far, and I don't remember any president going this far in an issue of this sort, but as saying any Democrat in Congress who criticizes, who runs for Congress and criticizes a Republican for voting for NAFTA, he will not support. So one has to ask the question, and this is sort of tangential to my main point, why is it that on all these other issues Clinton has wavered so, yet on this set of foreign economic issues, he's been so firm and unconditional? And I think the imperatives of governing in a globalized world economy, independent of the political party. See, it suggests that the political party doesn't matter much. It doesn't matter who's in the White House, which party's in the White House, for that agenda. And that has forced, I think, the Clinton presidency, though, into an odd situation. Because it's had such difficulty with the Bosnia-Somalia set of issues, it's backed away from those issues and has just enunciated a position on UN peacekeeping, which is almost the direct reverse of what the Clinton people were promising during the campaign. They promised assertive multilateralism, a much stronger United Nations, a disposition to handle conflict situations by reliance on the United Nations. Now they've enunciated a set of guidelines which are the most constrained one can imagine, that the U.S. will in general not participate or support UN peacekeeping missions unless the place where the mission is to occur has already given consent, and unless there's an advanced so-called exit strategy, which is like signaling your adversary to wait till the I mean, it's a completely incoherent way of approaching peacekeeping if you have any kind of difficult conflict situation that you're trying to address. Imagine telling the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia that you will leave by a certain date. Obviously, they can read too, and they will wait until that date in order to pursue whatever goals they wish. But the main point, I think, here is that there is such a determination to pursue this low visibility foreign policy and a realization that that's impossible if one is entering these conflict situations that are so beset by political violence and require some kind of exposure of those participating to life-threatening situations, that the Clinton administration has essentially abandoned its commitment to help provide some kind of response to these humanitarian disasters that are emerging around the world. And we see it now in this policy embodied in vivid form in relation to Rwanda and to some extent the civil war in Yemen. Now, in effect, what is being said is there's nothing that the United States is prepared to do about these situations, and that has the consequence of creating a great deal of public despair and distress because of what I would call the CNN factor. In other words, you can't just ignore massacres and tragedies around the world. And George Bush didn't ignore the CNN factor. I think he was led both in Iraq to establish the protective zone for the Kurds in northern Iraq as a result of the television coverage of the fleeing Kurds and the cruelty of Saddam Hussein's policies toward them, and the famine pictures in Somalia induced the limited involvement there. And what I think Bush understood, as I said earlier, was that intervention is a very treacherous policy, and therefore one needed to make a sharper distinction between humanitarian undertakings and interventionary undertakings. Because the Clinton administration didn't clearly understand that distinction, or at least didn't act as if it understood that distinction, it's discredited the whole range of responses to these crises that are bound to emerge in the future, and has in the process led not to a strengthening of the United Nations, but a rediscrediting of the United Nations, a loss of confidence. And again, it is possible that the UN undertook to do too much. Too much was attempted. But what I think we are in danger of doing now is to lose the distinction between what it is the UN can do effectively and what it shouldn't be trying to do, given its own capabilities and given the nature of the problems confronting us in the world. Now, there is a further kind of explanation for this foreign policy ineptitude, I think. And that arises from the altered nature of the challenges confronting leaders in the world, and particularly the United States. Most of the last several decades, and arguably the last several centuries, have been preoccupied with the containment of strong states that were viewed as potential enemies. What foreign policy was at its core about was confronting force with force, and either establishing a balance, as it sometimes has been called, or deterring aggression, responding to aggression, addressing the problems of an expansionist state that projects its power militarily beyond its borders. Now, what we are experiencing, I think, in the period since the end of the Cold War is the challenge of the weak state, not the strong state. Instead of the geopolitics of explosion, the geopolitics of implosion, of failed states, of anarchy. And we don't have the tools or mechanisms to address this agenda of challenges. It isn't susceptible easily to military responses. And because it isn't susceptible to military responses, and that's what governments know what to do. That's what they tend to think about when they respond to political crises. It leads to a failure to explain adequately the nature of the problems and therefore the kinds of responses that would be appropriate to these problems. And so we are, I think, in an era of this kind of weak state challenge. And academically, as well as in terms of government policy, we've been very unsuccessful in understanding what to do. And because of that CNN factor, it becomes very anguishing to feel helpless in the face of these humanitarian disasters, or virtually helpless. Now, the final aspect of this failure is what is sometimes called spin politics, what one might call, perhaps unkindly, the David Gergen factor in the Clinton approach to foreign policy. And that seems to be unduly swayed by by both watching the polls, what is popular and unpopular in the immediate short run, and also making a kind of quick response to pressures from various directions, sort of juggling various kinds of pressures. And again, we see this with the Haiti policy right now. Randall Robinson engages in civil disobedience, a hunger strike, and the president changes the policy toward Haiti. Now, I think he should change. I mean, I think the policy was unnecessary and inhumane. But to have this kind of pressure brought to bear as the actuating cause of a change of policy, I think undermines, again, one's confidence in the sort of leadership that is required in this period. Now, a further aspect, I think, of the situation that confronts any leader, and to this extent, I don't think the Clinton administration should be particularly blamed, but I think it's important and relevant, that now that the Cold War is over and there is no real strategic enemy in the world, no credible strategic threat, and there is a domestic preoccupation with economic issues and competitiveness, there is a tendency for Congress to play a larger role in shaping foreign policy. And Congress naturally and inevitably reflects sectional interests and particular interests of various parts of the society. And to the extent that pressure is exerted on the presidency, it leads to more of a temptation to pursue inconsistent approaches to different kinds of issues. And it makes, it increases the temptation to juggle pressures rather than to develop principled, coherent policies. So all of this, it seems to me, adds up to this impression of a failed foreign policy at this stage, with the exception of the leadership in the foreign economic area, which is largely, as I've said, a legacy of the previous administration. And it seems to be, as I said at the outset, particularly sad because of this opening of international society after the long and dangerous tensions of the Cold War era. Now, I just wanted to mention two attempts to think more boldly about what might be done in this period, and to note their inability to really influence policy. The first and most notable attempt, I think, was that of Mikhail Gorbachev, who came to power, of course, in the closing years of the Cold War, while the Soviet Union was still a great power in the world. And he exerted, of course, an enormous influence on the foreign policy of the Soviet Union and the East-West relationship, basically succeeding in reversing the long period of hostility and substituting a period of reconciliation and accommodation for that. Whatever his motives were, that was he succeeded in the short run in doing that. But what isn't so widely appreciated is that he also was the most visionary thinker about global reform of any major leader in the world since Woodrow Wilson. His speeches to the United Nations calling for independent peacekeeping operations, compulsory jurisdiction of the World Court, for a much more law-oriented foreign policy, global approaches to environmental problems, and I think it represented a genuine part of his political commitment, and indeed he's spending his time, since he's been displaced from power, working on these issues with that same kind of visionary outlook. What I think has to be suggested is that his impact on world order thinking was rather minimal, even while the Soviet Union enjoyed the influence that it had. And that was essentially, I think, because the political leadership of the world is still very much entrapped in ways of thinking that do regard conflict and the territorial state as the foundation of international society for the indefinite future, and are remain reluctant to make the sort of political adjustments that a more integrated world economy and information order, I think, over time will entail. Now, the other big attempt at bold thinking was George Bush's advocacy of the New World Order, a phrase that caught on all over the world, sometimes as a threat. It was seen in Africa and the Third World as a kind of new mandate for imperialism. But it was seen anyway as an appropriate way of grasping the historical importance of the end of the Cold War, and as a way of saying something is really fundamentally different. Now, again, if one thinks of this advocacy or definition of the New World Order from a foreign policy perspective, it was very successful in the Gulf crisis in mobilizing a coalition of countries under the auspices of the United Nations to respond to Iraq's aggression against Kuwait. But again, as a world order conception, it has had a minimal, if that, impact, and was soon abandoned even by Bush himself. Because during the crisis, you remember, he said that with the end of the Cold War, we now have the chance, in a very Wilsonian way, to create a genuine collective security system based on the cooperation of leading countries under the auspices of the United Nations, and that the Iraqi aggression creates a test that can be and must be met, and that this test will shape the post-Cold War world. James Baker was at Princeton a few days ago for a kind of off-the-record talk, and people asked him, whatever happened to the New World Order? And his response was interesting and I think relevant. He said, we did a lousy job explaining it. What we should have said is that our way of life prevailed in the Cold War and is now what everyone in the world is really seeking. And by that he meant political constitutionalism and a reliance on privatization and the market economy. And of course that does correspond a little bit with the rhetoric that Anthony Lake and Bill Clinton have used to the extent they've described an overarching purpose in their foreign policy. They've talked about the enlargement of market-oriented democracies. They emphasize, I think, the market more than the democracy part. A lot of countries are forgiven for abandoning democracy, such as Peru, if they remain committed to privatization and a market orientation. The point here, again, though, is that from the perspective of world order, the New World Order has pretty much been relinquished as a project. And we do face a situation where the end of the Cold War, unlike the end of World War I and World War II, is not seen or has not been seized as a moment where the attempt to provide a safer, fairer world has been seized. And I think there are two things that could have been done and I think still could be done. One is a real commitment to demilitarization on a global level. And by that I mean not only controlling the proliferation of nuclear weapons, but embarking on a policy of commitment to nuclear disarmament, which I think is the only assured way of controlling proliferation of weapons of mass destruction over time. And I think there was the real possibility, without a strategic conflict in the world, I think had the United States and others exerted leadership, one might have moved quite far in two directions. One is a nuclear-free world, which was one of Gorbachev's objectives, and the other would be a much stronger regime of control over the sale of conventional weaponry, which is very much responsible for the magnitude of the violence that one sees in some of the African countries and elsewhere in the world. And the second area that I think could have been really dealt with in an exciting way is to have made international and regional security institutions much more independent of the leading states that finance and support them. In other words, I think we do need, if we're to deal with these problems of weak states, we do need an independent capability under UN auspices that isn't seen as just a front for the most powerful country in the world. And this may seem like two visionary ideas, but it strikes me that those are the kind of visionary ideas that, had they been pursued seriously and with an explanation to the American people and to the world, could have led in this period to a kind of underpinning, coherent underpinning for American foreign policy that wouldn't have led to the kind of critique that I and others have been making. And it would have, I think, enabled a kind of leadership in this very difficult situation that we confront in the world to have emerged. And we could have then been meeting today and celebrating the Clinton foreign policy instead of complaining about it. Let me stop there. Thank you. The question was, what I had just said applies to the most difficult and serious problems in the world, illustrated by the crises in Bosnia and Haiti. So would I now, having enjoyed the role of critic, would I now turn and play the role of president and say what should be done? Well, Haiti is by far the easier. See, there was an agreement on Haiti. It's also an area where the United States has real historical responsibilities and contributed directly to the evil that the Haitian society has endured for decades. So there's a responsibility that needs to be explained to the American people, but it's there. There's a historical responsibility. There was an agreement. And Haiti has a very poorly equipped, tiny army of 7,000. Not, if we could win in Grenada, I don't see why we can't win in Haiti. But that isn't the point. I think the point was that after Somalia, we were so easily intimidated that we didn't try to do what we said we would do and what the UN was committed to doing, that is, restoring a democratically elected leader to power that the military had accepted. I think it would have been dangerous. I think Aristide very likely would have been assassinated. But I think it was a risk that he wanted to take and that we had been committed to, and that President Clinton had promised to act on. So I think we should have tried to follow through on the Haitian commitment. And then I think, as far as the refugees are concerned, I think that there were many ways of handling it that are now being resuscitated that would have been much less objectionable. And one of the ways was not to concentrate all the Haitian refugees in Florida. See, that's a kind of unnecessary. See, if we're a big enough country that if they'd been spread out, it wouldn't have created the kind of issue that emerged. So it was very unimaginatively handled. Now, Bosnia, I have always felt is an extremely difficult situation, because it's the Serbs have, there's no question, have engaged in horrifying behavior, but it's a complex historical, ethnic conflict with severe historical memories, traumatic historical memories by all the major parties. It is, in part at least, a civil war, and it's in a terrain where it's very difficult to act. The scale of the military effort that would be required to do anything really effective is extremely high. European countries are very divided as to what they want to see happen. So there's no outside consensus as there was in relation to Kuwait, for instance. Germany wants one thing, France another, Russia another. And therefore, it's hard to reach a policy that isn't at the lowest common denominator. And so I think that there is no good response beyond, in my view, the embargo is a big mistake. And President Clinton has said that at times he said that he's in favor of lifting it, because what we have sort of been doing is to pretend to be intervening on behalf of the victims of this kind of aggressive criminal behavior in Bosnia, but actually imposing a set of conditions that makes it harder for the Bosnians to defend themselves. So again, it's the sort of worst of both types of policies. And see, one of the, and this doesn't apply particularly to the Clinton administration, but applies generally, cheap fix interventions don't work. And they usually are a result of public pressure to do something. But doing something doesn't necessarily help those that are being victimized. You have to do something appropriate. And doing something appropriate can be costly and risky. And pinprick bombing is not going to change, but air power has never changed the political outcome of a struggle. And you can't have an intervention in an ongoing struggle of that sort that is conducted at a distance from the air or by sanctions. It just won't work.
Now, unfortunately, we haven't exhausted our topic of the evening. It would be better for everyone that we had, but there are many unanswered questions. But I think tonight's presentation has been really quite extraordinary in its scope and in the interesting questions which Professor Falk also raised in the latter part of his presentation. But I think the interpretations have been indeed extraordinarily interesting and enlightening. So for an appropriately educating evening, we thank you very much.